Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining us for this episode of the Surge Ahead podcast. I'm Dr. Shanna Katz Kattari, your hostess with the mostess. And as always, I'm delighted to have you join us here as we share our research, teaching, and praxis experiences when it comes to sexuality, relationships, and gender. Today's guest is Dr. Meg Paceley, who uses they, them pronouns. Meg is a social worker, community organizer, and scholar engaged in research that examines factors in the social environment, such as families and communities, and broader systems, such as policies, societal rhetoric, and their relation to lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, and other non-cisgender heterosexual youth mental health. They aim to identify and evaluate macro strategies, and by macro we mean community organizing and activism, policy advocacy, education, etc., to confront stigma, discrimination, and victimization that contribute to the mental health disparities amongst LGBTQ plus youth. They embed their research in principles of anti-oppressive practice and theoretical frameworks such as social ecological systems theory, minority stress theory, and critical theories. They also use scholarship to impact social work education by examining and evaluating how social work education can be more social justice driven. Meg's work in this area has primarily focused on LGBTQ plus inclusion in social work education, as well as broader themes of racial and social justice, as well as trauma-informed pedagogies. Whew. Finally, Meg utilizes and promotes arts-based research methods as a strategy for engaging in progressive social change and reducing stigma in the research process. That is a mouthful, and I cannot wait for us to dig down and share that in a little bit more plain language for all of you. And also, dear listeners, Meg is one of my closest academic friends. We have been in community together for almost or over a decade now. I see some hearts from both of us. Heart eyes for me, heart hands for Meg. And I'm just really excited to have them on our show. So, welcome, Meg, first of all.
Thank you, Shanna. It's nice to be here.
And let's just get started. Meg, I know how brilliant you are, but our listeners are just meeting you. So can you give us a little bit about who you are? Tell us about yourself, how you came to the work you do, and just share a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a long story, but I will make it short for the sake of the podcast. My MSW, my master's in social work internship was with an LGBTQ campus-based organization. And I knew that I wanted to do macro work with LGBTQ people, but being in the middle of Illinois, I was like, I don't really know how I'm going to do that here. But I had the amazing opportunity. It really did just fall into my lap to start an LGBTQ community center in the town that I was in right at the end of my MSW. And I worked with them, not paid. It was all grassroots. There was no money. There probably still isn't money, but they do still exist for 16 years. I don't know. It's been a long time.
That's amazing. They're still around.
Yes, yes. So I did a lot of like program development, program evaluation, a lot of macro work, working directly with queer and trans youth. And that really informed my entire PhD program. So I knew that I wanted to impact the mental health and well-being of queer and trans youth, but I didn't want to do it in a clinical way. I was not a clinician. I find that work really important, but I really wanted to address the issues in the environments that they were situated in. Though those environments are what cause the mental health issues that we see. If queer and trans youth were growing up in accepting, affirming homes, schools, political environments, they wouldn't have the mental health issues we see. And so my research really looks at those systems and those spaces.
Yeah, and for our listeners, just because we have a wide audience, when we say clinicians and we're talking about social work, this can mean folks like therapists, case managers. These are the people that work one-on-one with folks, or sometimes, one on a couple or one on a family relationship, that type of thing. And when we say macro, we're talking about things related to policy, things related to systems, things related to community. So just wanted to make sure we had a little literacy moment there.
Exactly.
For our listeners.
Yeah, thank you.
So, you've mentioned that this is how you came to the work you do, but will you tell us a little bit more about your research? I shared a whole bunch of different theories and ideas back here. Will you tell people what that is and what your research looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the end of the day, my research looks at all of these different spaces and environments that queer and trans youth are in, their families, their schools, the communities that they live in, and especially now the political climate that they're growing up in, and really looks at the different factors that happen in those spaces and how it impacts their well-being. The ultimate goal is to think about how we intervene, how we make changes in those spaces to either reduce the impacts of those harmful environments or how we eliminate health disparities and mental health challenges overall. At the same time, I'm also looking at what are the positive things that are happening in those spaces so that we can think about how do we intervene to make more of that, right? So thinking about families, when we can see what's working well in a family with queer and trans young people, we want to see how do we then duplicate that across families? How do we take families from more rejecting, for example, to more accepting so that we can, again, have better lives and outcomes for queer and trans young people? So that's sort of the short version. I would say the majority of my most recent work has been looking at the social climate and the political climate, specifically for trans youth, as we've seen that worsening over the last several years.
Yeah, you say intervention, and I think for a lot of people, we hear the term intervention, and folks think that that means, um, one-on-one therapy, right? Like, I also want to just note for people that are tuning in and might not know what's going on as far as the mental and health well-being of young people, particularly queer and trans young people, is that at least in the US, which is where both of our work tends to be centered, there's really high rates of depression, anxiety, non-suicidal self-injury. So those are things like cutting, burning yourself, putting yourself in harmful situations, as well as suicidal ideation, which means people who are either thinking about suicide and then also attempts related to suicide, right? So these are higher for both queer and trans people than the general population of cisgender or non-trans people, and higher than the general population of straight people. And then for trans people, it's even higher than queer folks. And this is true across the board, but especially true for young people. And a lot of the intervention we see is like, how do we get a young person a trans affirming therapist? Or how do we get a young person into a gender affirming care setting? And those are things that we've been working on a lot. And I would say to some extent, there's also been historically some research, I say historically, like 2015, that talks about the importance of, using correct names and pronouns and how that actually can reduce anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, like all of these things we just named, like simply having that or having a trusted adult in someone's life. So that's where a lot of the interventions have been focused. And there's a reason why, obviously, like we are in what I would call a crisis around, um, you know, what is happening for queer and trans young people. And you're talking about interventions at a bigger level, right? If we're talking again, that macro term that we use. So, you mentioned interventions at the family, interventions at the community level. Could you give me a little more information about what that might look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I thank you for clarifying that. I think, the whole reason that I want to focus on these macro environments or environments beyond a more like clinical therapeutic setting is because that's where the harm originates, right? If we can stop the harm from happening or reduce the amount of harm, then we don't need as many therapeutic interventions because kids aren't getting to the point where maybe they need that, right? And so thinking about possible interventions, I talked about the family, I'm working with somebody right now to look at how parents, specifically cisgender heterosexual parents, are socializing their queer and trans kids and thinking about positive, healthy socialization. And so how can we create an intervention for potentially for clinicians to use, but also more broader in terms of like parenting, parent education interventions, things like that. And that's a little less macro, but I think when we think about more of these macro spaces, especially like organizational interventions and the political environment, even some of the things you named. How do we institutionalize using the correct names and pronouns in schools or in organizations? I've done a lot of work with social work and other mental health helping organizations about how can they change their policies and practices to be more queer and trans affirming as an intervention, right? If somebody's coming in to see your clinicians, it doesn't matter how affirming that clinician is if they're called the wrong name in the waiting room, if the only bathrooms are gendered male and female, right? And so thinking about organizational level interventions, and then even higher up when we're thinking about the political environment right now, how do we get ourselves, queer and trans people, families, other social workers involved in more policy advocacy to actually be fighting the political environment that we're in? And so thinking about interventions to prevent and reduce harm at those like higher level systems.
How has, sometimes research versus community, is almost juxtaposed, but I know you're a community researcher, right? You do research
Yeah.
with communities. How is, your kind of, I wouldn't say, oh, maybe it's a pivot, right? It's a pivot of some sort. You've moved away from like some of the more like specific, just talking to queer and trans youth and now really doing work with communities and families. How's that been received for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I love working with youth and with themselves, and I've definitely worked with them as co-researchers, as I think I get older too, thinking about my own position as a more middle-aged person too. And a recent study that I did, which I know we'll talk about, we interviewed both parents and their adolescent kids, and I interviewed more parents than adolescent kids. And I think partly because of age, potentially, I don't really know. I connected with the parents in a different way, right? Whereas some of the students that I worked with who are younger than me and interviewed the kids themselves, maybe even had a closer connection with the kids just because of age. And so when I think about kind of changing who I'm working with, it's not even really changing who I'm working with, but I guess expanding who I'm working with. I miss talking with the young people. It just hasn't come up as much lately. But I think it's still received in the same way, right? The parents are still super grateful to talk to somebody who is supportive and understands can I cuss? The hell that they're going through, right? I don't know why I asked that question.
I'm like, we're not regulated by anyone.
Right. But the hell that they're going through in this political environment, and to have somebody to just like provide space for them to have all of the emotions that they're holding on to in order to protect their kids, right? And so I think in that way it's been really positive. And yeah, all of my work, or at least most of it, I try to keep as community grounded and engaged as possible, because I think even though I'm part of this community, I'm not 15, right? And I'm just not. I don't know what it's like to grow up a trans kid in 2026. It sounds horrible, right? In terms of the climate that they're living in. I can empathize and I can bring in my own stuff, but at the end of the day, I don't know. And so having them connected to the research process feels really important.
I love that. And just for our listeners, we're recording this in May 2026. So for those who are outside of the US or inside the US and just not as connected, over the past several years, there have been literally thousands of anti-trans bills that have been proposed at state legislatures, of course, at the federal level. Also, anti-trans rhetoric in school board meetings, in county spaces. There is including in what we would consider progressive or blue states, a number of clinics have shut down their gender affirming care programs including in states that were considered kind of sanctuary states for folks. And I'm here in Michigan, where the vast majority of Midwesterners, if they were leaving anti-trans states such as Ohio, Indiana, et cetera, or I won't say the states are anti-trans, that are passing these types of bills. A lot of them were driving up to Michigan for care or moving to Michigan for care, and then University of Michigan shut down their adolescent gender affirming care program. Colorado shut down theirs, although recently the Colorado Supreme Court has required them to reopen, which is great. But we're seeing hospitals in San Diego and Washington, D.C. and other spaces. So this is not really a red state, blue state thing. This is people losing access to literally life-affirming care. They're seeing politicians debate their reality, their livelihood. Passports can no longer be issued in people's correct um, names and pronouns, or not pronouns, but gender markers. We have some places like Kansas that have literally taken away people's driver's licenses and made them invalid, right? So that impacts older teens and what that looks like. And, it's hard enough being a young person, period, right? It's hard being a queer and trans young person, period, although it had gotten quite a bit better over the past, decade or two than it was perhaps when we were queer and trans young people. And it's really the backslide has been aggressive and fast and really overwhelming. So, I'd love for you to add anything else that I've missed to the socio-political climate that's happening here. But when we talk about these implications, that's kind of the framing of what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you summed it up. I just put together some slides for a presentation I'm doing next week, and it was like every time I have to put these slides together that talks about, okay, in 2021 we saw this and it was really hard, and now we've like tenfold that number, right, of bills that are being proposed across the country. And this all exploded also in 2025 with the new federal administration, where in addition to all of these state level bills that were being proposed and passed, we had executive orders that were directly and indirectly targeting trans people in particular. We had proclamations from the president specifically naming like trans affirming parenting as child abuse, right? All of these things. And then like,
which it's not. I just want to be very clear that there is so much research that shows that affirming your trans kid is literally saving their lives, and not doing so is abusive.
I mean, none of this is evidence-based, just for the record. None of what is happening at a state and federal level. But even things like changing federal rules around funding of hospitals, Medicaid and Medicare, right? To try to, they're unlikely to do an outright ban at the federal level of gender affirming care at this point, but they are going to make it as hard or as impossible for folks to actually get it, even in states where there are hospitals still providing it, not just for kids, for adults too. And so, yeah, this is this is the backdrop of what's happening and has been happening for 5+, I mean, it's been happening, but it really kind of started to blow up in 2021. And it's just expanded every year. And last year was like off the charts. And this year, I think we're already at 700 some proposed bills, and we're not even halfway through the year yet. So.
Yeah, and I think something, I've been talking with folks of, in our age, trans folks of a certain age, of the middle-aged guard, if you will. And, one of the things that we were talking about is like, it's important to share with young people that things, I'm trying to think about how to phrase this. For us, things were bad growing up, right? Around being able to come out. And like most of the trans people I know in our age group were not out in middle school, high school, even college for most of us, right? Like many people knew they were trans, but were not out in spaces or didn't have access to any of this care. And so really, the kind of like mid 2000s through like 2020, where this like almost boom of access, of validation, of affirmation, right? And like, how much does it warm your heart to see kids coming out in elementary school and feeling validated in that way? And like an elementary kid, school kids knowing how to use correct pronouns and just validating people in that way, right? Like it's been so beautiful. And the increase in access to care, I think about a former partner, forever family of mine, who will be on the show later. Um, but when he was getting his top surgery, they were like, everybody was like, you should go to one of these five surgeons in the country, right? The assumption was you had to travel to get gender affirming care, all of this. So there's been this like really great boom. And as we are backsliding so rapidly and so quickly, for a lot of young people, they never had the negative experiences before, right? If they were born in 2005 or even, 2000, by the time they were at a point where they were coming out, they've always had this like, we're moving forward, we're getting better, more affirmation, more validation, more access to good providers, to schools that support you. And suddenly this is being taken all away. And so for some of the, older adults, we're like, this sucks. And we survived this, right? Like, not all of us, but many of us survived this, and we will be able to survive this again. But for young people that don't have that historical context, this is just this heartbreaking, I'm thinking like tearing away, ripping of their like social fabric of what it means to be trans in community. So I'm wondering, I looked at your paper around, there's a paper that recently came out in LGBTQ plus family about parental gender identity socialization among trans and gender expansive youth in the US. And you kind of came up with a grounded theory conceptual model. I'm wondering if you could tell us, A, what does that even mean? And what have you found? What do we do in this context, and how do we support LGBTQ youth the best we can?
Yeah, I think definitely talking about that, and then I can talk about a study where the paper's under review, so you all might be the first to hear some of the
Ooh, yes,
findings. But
please.
yeah, so short version, grounded theory is a form of analyzing qualitative data, which is like text. So interviews, focus groups, basically like not a survey. So it could be a survey, but generally not a survey.
Not
So
numbers.
us talking right now, we would have a transcript of our interview and we would analyze it, right? Grounded theory specifically looks at like what is going on, like what is a process that's happening here, and how can we put it into like a picture, like a model, a sort of like tiny theory, right? Not a big theory like
A little T
one we
theory.
learn in school, a little T theory. You could take a whole semester's worth of classes on grounded theory, so I won't go there, but that's like the gist, right? And so this was part of a study where we interviewed parents in 2020 and 2021. And so that timing is important because it was right at the beginning of this increase in anti-trans hostility and policy, very different from now, 5 years later. And we really wanted to understand how cisgender heterosexual parents were engaging in socialization practices. And so when I say that, I mean the explicit and implicit messages they were giving their children. So really obvious, like, hey, if you're gay, I'm going to support you. That's explicit, right? Whereas an implicit might be, hey, boys don't wear that color, right? Or something along those lines. Both of those send a message, one good, one not so good, about gender, maybe about sexuality, right? But in pretty different ways. And so we wanted to understand what parents, sort of the behaviors and the processes that they were going through. And then we looked at sexual orientation and gender identity differently. So there's also a paper out there about sexual orientation, socialization, because we thought, given the ways that gender shows up, given the challenges that parents may have with a kid coming out as gay versus a kid coming out as trans, we wanted to look at those separately. So this paper that you're talking about, we are specifically looking at gender. And it was interesting, right? I mean, some of them were parents talking about the challenges that they faced and how they navigated dealing with their own sort of internalized stuff. And you would think that doing interviews with parents and adolescents, that we would get predominantly supportive families, and that wasn't the case. We had parents who said, I don't really know about this whole pronoun thing, right? I'm paraphrasing. Or that we're fine maybe with an earlier sexual identity disclosure of identity, but we're really struggling with a trans non-binary identity being shared. And so that study feels really important to me because it's moving us beyond just like, are parents accepting or are they not accepting? Because a lot of times it's this mushy space in the middle. Do I need to define mushy space? I'm kind of
What
kidding, but
I'm
it's this
hearing is
like
that binaries don't serve us.
binaries do not serve us. But it's this understanding of like most of the parents, especially from the kid perspective, had some behaviors that fell across a spectrum of acceptance or non-acceptance, right? That maybe they were definitely accepting, but that didn't mean that all of their behaviors perfectly read as accepting to their kids. And so it got into a much more nuanced understanding of parental behaviors. And again, that's something that we're hoping to turn into a possible intervention that we create and test to better understand what parents and kids are going through. And again, that was in 2020, 2021. That we used what's called dyadic interviews, which means we interviewed the kid and the parent at the same time, but separately. So we had two sort of separate Zoom rooms where we were interviewing them. This newest study that I just mentioned, is it okay if I jump into it? Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. We did the same method. So we interviewed parents of trans kids aged 19 and younger, any age. So their kid could be 3 or 19 or anywhere in between. And then for any of them that had an adolescent, 13 to 19, we also interviewed their adolescent child. So we had 22, I think, families. 8 of them had adolescent kids, and the rest were younger than 13. And this study started in summer of 2025. And the whole goal of this study was to understand how parents of trans kids and their trans kids were navigating the current political climate. We really wanted to understand as early as possible in 2025 what is going on with these families. We know that they're struggling. We've known that they're struggling for years under the current political climate, but it so drastically changed in early 2025 that we wanted to try to capture as much of that as possible. And as you can imagine, like there's so much going on. So we have a paper under review right now that talks about the mental health challenges that both youth and parents are experiencing. These parents were amazingly supportive. I mean, just would go, we're going to testify at their legislature. Had never done that before, but we're like, I don't know what else to do. I have to tell them not to do what they're doing or to try to pass something positive, right? Depending on the state that they lived in. And sort of like big picture end of this project, what we saw is that both kids and parents were being negatively impacted by the mental health or by the political environment. And I can talk about how parents were engaging in all of these strategies to try to protect their trans kid, which was buffering them at all ages. But that those behaviors that they were engaging in inadvertently were also increasing their stress. So parents were taking on all of the stress, as we do as parents, right? But all of the stress from the political environment. And then they weren't, there wasn't a space for them to have these feelings, to have, because they were in protector mode. Every single parent I interviewed, I think I cried in every interview because there would come a point when they would just like have this release of emotion and this recognition of, I've actually not talked about any of this. It's September of 2025 and I've been dealing with this for 9+ months because we knew it was coming before January. And but this was a space focused just on them and having that space to just like 2 hours, right? Hour and a half to just share and talk about what was going on with them. Almost every single one had that moment. And so just realizing how incredibly stressful this political environment has been and continues to be for both trans kids and their parents in such a variety of ways. Like I knew, but also now we have it in the research and it's under review. So stay tuned.
Excellent. I really look forward to reading that. And I want to hold space for the doing of this research. You know, there's something in human service professionals work we call vicarious trauma, right? And this is where like therapists who are listening to people who've experienced violence, to sexual assaults, police violence, all of these things are like, all, you know, we see this in like first responders, EMTs, you know, other folks that are experiencing, right? And it's where you're like taking on almost some of what like the parents were taking on, right? And I think we don't talk about it as researchers, and especially as qualitative researchers. We did this, um, the SRG collective, a team of us, also under review, actually under revise and resubmit. So hopefully it will be out soon. Um, a project we were calling the Gender Refugees Project, where we were interviewing parents of trans kids who are either they're all in states initially that had gender affirming care bans before the new administration, right? So we interviewed them in like summer and fall of 2024, um, and who are either leaving their state or even the country, and then those who wanted to leave and couldn't, and those then who also were choosing to stay and fight. And these interviews were so beautiful, and in this case we really got affirming, those are the people who selected it, right? It's the people that are like, I care about my kids, and whatever it is, I'll do it. And they were all so hopeful about the 2024 election. Then I want to be clear that, like, while certain parties are very like inherently anti-trans, no party has been aggressively fighting for trans people, right? Like, there were a lot of things that happened under previous administrations that were also not trans affirming. So this is, not partisan. We are a pro queer, pro trans space, period, and not any particular party. But it was just heartbreaking because they had pinned so many hopes on this election, and then we've been coding this over the past year, and we can't, at least me, I can't do a lot of deep coding all at once because it's so heartbreaking. And yeah, I want to name that because maybe this is a research project for us to do together. And just to be clear, the way that often qualitative research, when we talk about analysis, right, is we have that data, we have those transcripts, and we go through, and there's lots of different ways to do coding, but it's where we like highlight different quotes and we're like, this is what is being said. And sometimes it's emotive coding, right? Like, this is frustration, this is engagement, this is hope. And sometimes it's words, we code something, we call it in vivo, and that's exactly what they said. So sometimes when you read qualitative work, like the title has a quote in it, and like that's an in vivo code. And sometimes we're looking for things specifically, like if I'm doing trans affirming care stuff, I might be looking for how providers were educated, provider interventions, those type of things. And then we take those and we turn them into themes, which are like umbrellas of codes, and then that's what we report out on.
Yeah. I will say the name of this paper that's under review is the name of one of our codes, and it's Loving Fiercely, because we couldn't and that captured really all of it, right? All of the codes sort of fell under that because it was like the amount of labor and emotion and intensity of what these parents were doing really came down to just like a process of like fierce love for their kids. And so yeah, it was beautiful. And I love that you named that about the research teams, because like there were 4 of us doing these interviews, 2 students, 2 faculty, all with some clinical experience working with queer and trans people. But we had, not at first, but once we realized how intense they were, we, shared with everybody who was doing interviews, build yourself in a little buffer time. Don't jump into another meeting. Text one of us if you need to. And I was texting, like, if I was interviewing the parent, I would text whoever did the kid interview and just check in and say, well, I've never cried in interviews before, and now I'm crying in all of them, right? Like those sorts of things. And then we had people cleaning our transcripts. So they're listening. And when I say cleaning, I mean de-identifying them, taking out names, making sure that the transcript through like Zoom caught it appropriately. But they're hearing it, right? So even though they're not in that space, they're also often queer and trans research assistants listening. And so we would have to give them a heads up, not have to, we chose to give them a heads up of like, hey, these are all intense. And if we had a particularly intense one, I would say, before somebody picks this one, FYI, these were some of the topics that came up. So they would know kind of what they were getting into, because it's really, really heavy. We should have
a little content note. It's important.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm looking at you now and I'm like, we need to do some sort of study on vicarious trauma for queer and trans. I mean, I'm sure it exists in other spaces, but for queer and trans scholars right now. We're coming closer to the end of our time, so I have my penultimate question and then my ultimate question coming for you. So we've talked about a couple of different things, what's going on. What is one takeaway that you want everyone who's listening today to hear and to engage with?
Yeah, I think it's that trans kids and their families, trans people deserve all of us to be fighting for them, that what's happening right now is wrong. And it is the responsibility of all of us to engage. And the research is clear, mine, other people's, yours. It's all clear that what's happening right now is rooted in hate and discrimination, oppression, and not in any sort of like actual facts or evidence. But it is what's taking the stage right now in terms of what everybody's hearing. And so any little thing you can do, even just correcting somebody in public, I mean, it's a little bit of a narrative shift, right? And so all the way up to like talking to your legislators. So there's a space for all of us to intervene in ways that are, I don't know, safer, whatever we need them to be, right?
Yeah, I'm actually wearing some trans flag earrings today because I found that, wearing trans paraphernalia, as it were, as if I was a sports fan, but a trans fan, is one little way that I try to, even when I'm not actively doing something, this passive way that people see that, trans people have always been here, trans people belong here, and absolutely trans kids deserve to grow up into trans adults, and we need to do whatever it takes to make that happen.
Absolutely.
So a lot of heavy things. And, I know you mentioned also really framing some of these positives. And I think about the importance with all of this of trans joy, because so much, gets tossed into dysphoria and negative experiences. And I do want to note that, two trans women that we know have been killed in the past week. Like, it is so heavy and so intense. So, from a framing of trans joy, what is one way that you are centering joy right now in your life, either personally or professionally?
That is a great question. Not what I thought you were going to ask, so I wasn't ready. I think for me personally, it's been leaning back into like my creative side. I've used creativity and research, which you named at the beginning, but like revisiting my theater kid self. And I was telling you off camera that, or not off, but off recording, that I was just in a musical for the first time, well, ever, but first play since like high school. And the first night we were in the theater doing rehearsal, I sat back and I was like, 16-year-old Meg would be like really happy and proud about this, right? And it was this whole moment. Yeah, it's making me tear up a little bit. So I think personally that's it. And I think for me, and I also know for other trans folks, like being in community and being around supportive, safe other trans people is like a source of joy right now. And so, yeah, I think that's what I'll end with.
Do you want to sing anything for us since I put you on the spot? You're like, absolutely not. Um, so where can people find more about you and your work?
Yeah, so I'm an associate professor at the University of Connecticut School of Social Work. So you can find my faculty page there. I'm also on Google Scholar, so all of my work is cited there. And yeah, my email is, I think, on the website at UConn. You can find me there as well.
Great. And this is also a surprise question, but you organized this beautiful writing of a love letter to trans young people a few years ago. Is that still available anywhere for people to find?
It is. It's up on the University of Kansas Center for LGBTQ plus Research and Advocacy website. Last I checked, it was still there.
All right, we'll try to make sure that we, drop that information as well. That was just speaking of centering joy and also advocacy, and something that you could do was this really beautiful collective letter that you had people write for trans young people as things started getting
Yeah, that was
harder.
in like 2022, I think.
Yeah.
So,
Oh,
so
I'm like
much has
last
even
year,
changed.
years and
No,
years ago.
like it was bad, but it's not even, yeah.
Well, thank
You
you
tried to
so.
end on a positive, and I was like, I took it back. I'm sorry.
No,
Yes,
it's
it's a
okay,
beautiful
right?
love
Like,
letter. Go read it.
it's a yes and
Yes,
binaries
yes.
don't serve us, right? Like with oftentimes, I'm gonna quote a play I was in middle school. This is my eighth grade play. Was The Mad Woman of Chaillot, and one of the last, the only line of this character, who's a mime throughout, is that sadness flies on the wings of the morning, and out of the heart of darkness comes the light.
Mm.
And it really makes me think about, I mean, you also have like Florence and the Machine, it's always darkest before the dawn, all of that. But oftentimes our positives come out of really harmful spaces, and and then we build more positives. And I will say, I don't think I've ever seen this many people fighting for trans folks before, because they didn't have to necessarily, or they didn't know as many trans people, or they were just disconnected from it. And so as much as we struggle with this, it does give me hope, and there are these beautiful pieces that come from that.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, I'm so glad that you came on this show, Meg. It was lovely to get to hear. We talk a lot about our work, but I don't think I didn't know your story of how you came to this. And I always just love hearing you talk about how deeply you care for community and how deeply you care for queer and trans youth. So thank you so much. And thank you, gentle listeners, for engaging with the Surge podcast as we work to bring our research, practice, and pedagogy to life during these trying times. Please visit srgcollective.com for this and other episodes, as well as to learn more about the work we're currently doing. You can also find us on LinkedIn and BlueSky. Together, we can build the world that we all deserve. Remember, we take care of us. I'm Dr. Shanna Katz Kattari, signing off.